Um, I'm also going to talk to you a little professorial analogy about the behavior of water and its relationship to what I would call the data security issue portion of these problems. And finally, I think we need regulation, but I also think we need to be realistic, and I want to get into the issues of the costs and the history of Sarbanes-Oxley, and whether or not these initial things turn out to ultimately do what we're hoping they're going to do. So that is my agenda today, and I'd like to go through each of these. And again, I encourage you to get involved in this discussion, and I will try to control the time that I have. And this is here as a debate. So let's take the first issue of whether or not you can really protect the data. And the first thing I want to really talk about here is that technology is growing exponentially. It's growing so quick. One of the areas of the work that I do has to do with the acceleration of technology and digital and how it's moving forward so quickly that in effect our other systems, such as the social and economic and legal systems, are only growing incrementally. And when you step back and look at it very seriously, what you're really saying is we're falling further behind. The gap is widening between what the law and the economics and the social, and by what I mean by the economic and the social is work, automation.
Can you hold up the mic here because there's a problem with the antenna. Thank you.
Okay, do you want me to use that one? This is okay if I do it like this?
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay, sorry. It was better before. What's that? It was better before? It was better before. How's this?
Not a problem of the distance, but to hold the ear and not ear.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I was holding it incorrectly. So what I want you to think about is that our ability to deal with the incredible acceleration and impact of the digital world from a legal, social, and economic perspective is widening. As we say, it's almost becoming impossible to control the realities of many of the things that are going on. Another piece, of course, there's a lot been written, and we've been studying about the behavior of millennials and then Gen Zs coming behind them, and I know that there's been some conversations already about educating the young people about just exactly what they're doing. And having them knowledgeable. But as we know right now, they're not as sensitive about hiding their data and information as many of us that are more experienced. Even doing a tremendous amount of work right now with the military in the United States on significant problems with military personnel and the fact that they don't understand that they're divulging certain information with Facebook and other things that they're doing that they're simply not aware of. And this is going to become a theme of, and I'm going to get back to this, is really the challenge between what is behavioral change versus what is legal and process-oriented things, or punishment, so to speak. In terms of the computer architecture of systems, I just came back from Colombia at a conference with the Israeli cybersecurity people, with some extraordinarily technical people, and I myself am a technical person, and I might suggest to you that any dreams of creating an architecture that's going to improve our ability to keep people from getting in is not realistic in the near future. Not to mention the fact that the proliferation of legacy systems throughout most organizations is close to being fairly out of control from an attacker's point of view. And I'll get a little bit more associated and detailed with this conversation, but our architectures are a long way from being secure. So we've somewhat created a monster. But I'm not going to be negative. Let's talk about these loophole issues that I've already been reading about. And this is very typical historically, but there's also issues of collection of personal data for legitimate interest. I know this is one of the things in the law as to what is the legitimate use of data. Is it going to be used for research? Is it being abused? These are vague areas that are already coming up in terms of what is the exact interpretation of the use of the data by organizations, and notwithstanding whether or not they're engaging in criminal behavior, as we might look at it, they're also pushing a competitive world that we'll talk about. So there's gray areas, as we call them, in terms of these interpretations that are already coming up with the GDP. Types of activities that are covered, once again, if it's regarding healthcare, if it's regarding research in other areas, there are still many clarifications that organizations are going to be asking about, and in a little while I'm going to come back to the Sarbanes-Oxley realities of what happened with that law, and I'll clarify that for you, because what we're seeing here is very, very similar issues that are beginning to come up already. And then finally, the governments themselves, the massive transfer of data from law enforcement agencies. What we're certainly seeing in the US, I don't know the extent of it here, is that our governments are already violating their own policies in the name of, you know, security, peace, and whatever. So all of these together are just some of the examples of dilemmas and challenges and clarifications that companies are going to be looking at, which is going to create a lot of conversation and dialogue in terms of exactly what the law means or doesn't mean. And let's for a minute talk about Sarbanes-Oxley. So how many of you know what Sarbanes-Oxley was? Just so, well, not everybody. So let me clarify it. After the Enron debacle in the United States and some of these companies that were falsely portraying their financial positions, Lehman Brothers and others, that led to the financial crisis, two congresspeople, Sarbanes and the other named Oxley, came up with a rule that affected technology organizations, certainly in the US, but anybody doing business with US firms, which created a tremendous amount of overhead, controls, so that the bad people wouldn't do the bad things anymore. It was a law to stop it. What immediately happened was everybody began to ask for interpretations of this law. It also, as I'll get to, increased dramatic laws, but the net or result of the Sarbanes-Oxley is that ultimately there was so much confusion that from an audit perspective, they eventually settled on, as long as you have a policy and you find it, you're in compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley. Now that's not what Sarbanes-Oxley was meant to do. So most people would tell you that Sarbanes-Oxley had a good idea, but at the end, it didn't facilitate the kinds of things that it was meant to do because the carrying out of it became problematic. So I'll get back to this. And again, this is not to say that the EU opportunity will not work. It's just things to be careful about. Because if we're not clear and it increases costs and it gets in the way of doing certain amounts of business, there begins to be a backlash on the economies of these organizations. So let's talk about prohibition, because I think this is very important. Now, prohibition in the United States was to keep people from doing a bad thing called getting drunk and drinking too much. And the government decided that it was going to protect the population by passing a law that would stop people from drinking liquor. They outlawed it, drinking in the United States. So let's look at what happened there. And before, you will find this on the internet, which I find an interesting quote. Prohibition of mutually beneficial exchanges is doomed to failure. All right? And I would say to you, keep that close to your heart as we go forward on this thing. But let's take a look. The first result of prohibition was that it permanently corrupted law enforcement, the courts, and politics. Because everybody, by the way, wanted to drink, all right? And this was part of the problem. But we were going to save the world by stopping people from drinking, and the results was everybody started paying everybody else off. Because even the law enforcement people, the courts, and the politicians wanted to drink too. In the same way that they all want to transfer data in the name of the goodness of the world. The second things, it established incredible amounts of illegal brewing. So it didn't stop the creation of it at all. This is like pot, you know? I mean, there's the debate on whether it's good or bad, and now in the US some people are legalizing it, but it created an economic industry, all right? And so I want you to think as we go forward as to looking ahead as to if these laws go into effect, what are the other businesses that are going to crop up as a result of this, legally or illegally, or in the country or outside of the EU? Secondly, it clearly expanded organized crime, all right? And however you want to define that, whether it's the mafia or anything else, you automatically created a business line of people who found a way to do this business. And this is the real interesting one. Within the first 6 months, did drinking and alcohol use go down? It absolutely did. And then that was the end of that. Because with the proliferation of the other things, alcohol consumption ultimately increased in the United States on the basis of the very law that was supposed to stop it. And again, we're not being righteous here. We're being pragmatic in the way these things tend to occur. And then finally, it was the cost that ran everything out of control. Because the more it happened, the more we had to stop it. The more we had to stop it, the more money we had to put together. The more bureaus we had to put together. Does it sound familiar in security around the world? All right, in air flight and everything else? No matter how much money we spend, it's not enough. All right? So it begins to become cost evasive, and what eventually happened with prohibition? It got revoked, all right? Now, did everybody go out and get drunk? Well, the real issue about the focus of prohibition, and again, keep on to this, keep this in our conversation, is that you had to teach people how to drink better. Isn't that what it really was? And to try to stop it completely without taking into all the considerations and ramifications of it, from an enforcement, from a reality, it was really about, we still need laws and we have them, but how do we really change the behavior of our young people and our older people to drink more wisely? Yeah? Make sense? Okay, so that leads me to this conversation about, and something that I talk about all the time, and that is process versus behavior. It's an amazing thing when we look at the way people solve problems in most organizations, including our government. And the immediate response is, let's put together a process that makes sure it doesn't happen. So let me give you another, what we call analogy. If someone commits a crime, all right, in most places, we put them in a place where they can't commit any more crimes. We call that jail, all right? Now, what happens in the history of putting people in jail? They go to jail and they're off the street and they don't commit any crimes, but inevitably, for most of them, what happens inevitably? They serve their time and then they come back. So what did the imprisonment do? Well, we find that most people who commit crimes and go to jail, when they come out, continue to commit those crimes, all right? So the process that we have of curing the problem tends not to stop people from doing it. It's a deterrent, right? And it keeps certain dangers, but it doesn't solve the problem. Now, another alternative in the system of helping people who've committed crimes is called rehabilitation. Now, what is rehabilitation? It is the process of changing the behavior of somebody in such a way that they recognize that committing that crime is not the right thing to do. But most people will immediately go to process. And while rehabilitation has shown to work, it is underutilized, it is costly, and it is hard to scale. So I want you to think about process versus rehabilitation, because I think right now what we're doing is process. We want to put together a process that's going to stop people from doing bad things. Okay, let's go on with this. It's not scalable, is my suggestion, because of the things that we saw with Sarbanes-Oxley. It costs a lot of money, there are loopholes, there are all kinds of things that come out. Will it be effective? It will have an effect. I want you to know this. It will have a positive effect. But is it scalable to the point that it's going to really cure the issue? I would question that. Research has shown that it is not. All right? There's nothing historically that is going to support data protection processes that are going to cure the problem, because while you're doing that, exponentially, getting back to the beginning, things are going to change, new things are going to come up, new ways of doing things, new issues that we haven't thought about. And what do we know about our legal system, our economic system, and our social system? They're going to fall further behind in their ability to deal with it. And if you want to catch up, it's going to cost you more money, it's going to cost you more people, and it's going to cost you more taxpayer dollars. Okay. How do you rehabilitate people in organization to abide by the policy is my question here. And I think a very important issue about the education of our population to change their behaviors. All right? Now that is something of interest, while you have the EU data protection laws. But I'm not saying throw that out, but it's not enough. Not enough. If you don't do this, the processes will have so much substantial cost that you will begin to hurt competition. Because there's going to be other people in other countries, in other places of the world, that are not going to play by the rules. I wish there were. I wish we could get everybody together with me in the Bronx, where I come from, all right, and have everybody agree to agree. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the Chinese are going to agree. I don't think the Russians are going to agree. And I'll get back to this in a minute, all right? So therefore, if you don't have 100% compliance, what is almost compliance? Am I saying it right? Is almost compliance is no compliance. Almost winning is losing. So these are, I mean, again, you'll get some benefit out of this, but perhaps not to the extent of all of the changes that are going to come before us. And there are things coming, the things I've seen at Columbia University, artificial intelligence, robots, machine learning, it's ahead of schedule. It's going to happen faster than the predictions, okay? So keep that in mind. You can change laws and processes, but you need to change behavior. And another word for changing behavior, if you look it up in the dictionary, is that happens to be sort of the definition of culture, which means the French culture and the American culture and the cultures throughout the world have to become more focused on what this issue means. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how our organizations behave and how you ultimately have to bring that into a profit and loss scenario. And I believe you can actually do that. Okay? And can you really do this across the EU? Now, I know everybody in the EU perfectly agrees, and there are no disagreements, and everything is just wonderful. About 3 weeks ago, I got a visit at Columbia. I got a call from Columbia that there were 2 people from the EU in education who actually practice in Brussels. Were coming to Columbia to talk about getting some information on a EU-centric education policy for the workforce issues from automation and the disappearance of jobs. Good cause. Both of them were from Italy, and so the pasta was very good. But let me tell you, they spoke a lot about all of the disagreements in the EU. So let's not, we can't even get agreement in the United States across states. And you're better in the EU than we are in the United States, if you've been reading the press lately, all right? So getting to agree is not going to get so easy, and not getting full agreement in some ways means perhaps no agreement. So, and then the evolution of these cultures is not going to happen tomorrow. It took hundreds of years to create cultures, and they evolve slowly if they're going to be sustainable. So we need to embark, as we're going through these laws to protect us in the immediate future, a deeper thing of going to grassroots, whether that's children, and I don't know how many of you have young children. Have you been watching them lately? Do you see the way their brains have been formatted, and the way they're using data, and the way they're using tablets? It's a whole different population that's coming. And the newest information we have is that millennials will be moving into management positions much faster than any of their predecessors. They're going to be running the world soon, all right? And people are going to retire, and all of those things are happening at substantial rates. So it is very important that at the same time that we do this for the immediate future, that we get engaged at a longer term thing. You know, it's like climate change, you know? You know, if you're going to wait to the last minute, you're not going to evolve anything. Am I doing okay? This okay? Okay. Now let's get to the governments, because I think that they're getting off easy on this thing. So let's talk about some things that they should be doing. And let me ask you a question. What do you think the most important role of the government is? Does anybody have you can shout it out at me. What do you think the number one most important thing that your government should be doing for you? What's that?
Making sure people have the same rules.
Okay. I'd say that's in the top 5, but what do you think is even more important that we've seen happen around the world that has changed the political climate, even in your country, in Germany, in the UK, and certainly in the United States?
Security.
You got it. Security. Safe. The first number one important thing that people care about, and it's been proven politically in the last 2 years, that if I don't feel safe, I get scared, that changes everything. So I ask you, the question is, what is the government doing to keep you safe? That's fair. I mean, there's a whole bunch of others that are really close. But I think the first thing is, I expect the United States to protect me. I want to be safe. And if I don't feel safe, and my family is not safe, and my children are not safe, I get very nervous about all of these proper and democratic types of things, because when people get fearful, and I'm talking about human development theory now, they become more dualistic. And we've seen that with the immigration problems and the terrorism. It's pushed us back, much of our population, not all of it, but we're fearful that our governments are not keeping us safe. So the first thing I would say to you is, what should the government do to keep us safe? So I have another question. Why isn't the Iranians or Russians or any of our enemies dropping a bomb on us? Why don't they drop a bomb on Paris? Why don't they do that? Why don't you do that? Why don't you drop a bomb on Moscow? Why don't you do that? Why shouldn't the United States drop a bomb on Moscow? They messed up our elections. So why don't we drop a bomb on them? Anybody have an answer to that? You bet. So you got it. This is not that cut, right? So the reasons why people don't drop bombs on other people is because if they do that, there's a price to pay. And everybody gets it. If you attack me, I'm going to attack you. And if we both do that, what happens? It's a disaster. So we don't do it. Now, most of all of this data security problem is being led, as we all know, not by individual companies. There's some of that, or individuals. They're being supported and led by governments, particularly in our case by the Russians and the Chinese. Now, they screwed us up, didn't they? What do we do about it? As, by the way, where I come from, we say it this way: what are you going to do about it? Now, where I come from, if you mess up my data, what am I going to do? I think I'm going to come and get your data. So what did the United States do against Russia? Nothing. And what is your government doing when all of your companies are getting attacked? They're not doing their job, and they're not keeping you safe. So I think that one of the things that has to happen here is that there needs to be a new set of unwritten rules. You don't drop bombs on me, I won't drop bombs on you. If you attack one of my companies, I'm coming after you. All right? I'm not going to drop bombs on you because I can't do that, because we already have an agreement on that. All right? But I'm going to attack your computer systems. And I'm going to make you so miserable and make you pay for what you did that, you know what? You're not going to do that anymore. So I think that we should get all these government officials together and we should send them for a meeting with me in the Bronx. Because I have to tell you, they're failing all of us in not doing what they need to do. They're playing around. And you know why they're playing around? Because they're doing it too, aren't they? But they just don't tell you about it. You don't think the United States is messing with the Russians or the Iranians or anybody else? Of course they are. So the way I'd say it to you is, our government's got to get their act together and say, this has got to stop. It may not be poison gas, all right, which we had an agreement worldwide. It may not be bombs, but we have to have an agreement among nations. We need a NATO here, all right, where if you attack me and stop the nonsense and tell me you didn't do it, because I know you did it, all right, we're going to all gang up on you and come after you. Incidentally, when the Chinese premier, I know this because I have friends in the Bronx, by the way. If you repeat this, I'll deny it. When he went to see Obama, you know what he told him? He told him that his country was the one that took all the data from the government. He admitted to it. And you know what they did with that data? They sold it to the Iranians. And I know this because I know people in the government areas and secret areas that have been compromised and have been notified by the government that their data was turned over to their enemies. And these people are living in secret because the enemy knows who they are. It was the Chinese that did that. Hello? Everybody knows. So I think our governments have to step up and protect us instead of punishing us. All right? And they are punishing us. And they're punishing a lot of our companies who are not doing, there are companies doing bad things. But there are many companies that are trying to survive in this crazy world that is going on right now with digital disruption. All right, so where is the data going? The answer is, I don't know what they're doing with the data either. So they're about as guilty as everybody else. What percentage of data transferred is sponsored by government-led attacks? The reason they're not stepping up is they have to give up something as well. But they're not telling you about it. What do they call that? Not divulgeable and secure, all right? There's a lot going on that we don't know about. Can government stop the attacks? By retaliation threats. I think this is an area that has to start happening, and not in the way it's happening now. It's too loose. We're allowing it to happen, and it's going to continue until we stop it. Data privacy threats and the realities of water. So let's talk about water now, all right? I don't know if you look at water, but that's what I do at Columbia. I watch water. And one day in my house, there was a little tiny crack, all right? A little tiny crack in my basement. And one day, water came in. And I said to myself, how the hell did that water find that crack? And it's an amazing thing about water. It keeps going and keeps going and keeps going until it finds the path of least resistance. So you know, when you go home, take some water and spill it and watch what it does. It goes here, and it goes there, and it goes there, and eventually it goes to the path of least resistance. Now, what the hell does this mean? Well, you take water, and you take little viruses that you put inside a computer system, and I'm telling you, this is what happens technically. It's like water. It gets into the network, and it keeps flowing around, and it keeps flowing around until it finds the path of least resistance. It's going to find that legacy system at some point, and what do you got? You got a data breach, all right? And at this point, it's going to be decades, right? by the time you have these systems redone, if at all. So these are going to continue. And this is what you're going to see in the game of data breaching, of security, and all of these things. You're going to do something to your architecture, I'm going to change it. When someone important comes to town in Paris or Aix-en-Provence or Marseille, what do you do to protect that person? You ever see this? I know they do it in New York. When the president comes to New York, they shut down streets, but they don't tell you which streets they're going to shut down. So the way they keep you out is not by keeping it out. What they do is they change architectures of the streets. Well, unfortunately, with the technical people that I work with, we don't have those kinds of architectures yet. So these things get in, and this is what happened, by the way, to JP Morgan. I know there's some people from Deutsche Bank here. You're wonderful. But JP Morgan Chase, this is exactly what happened. They got a virus inside the computer, and it behaved just like water. It went through the main systems, it traveled around, and bingo, it found the area of least resistance. And that's what you're going to see with the rollout of this whole EU data protection. There's going to be water all over the place, and they're going to find little areas of weaknesses that the human mind simply couldn't think about, while everything is changing at an accelerated rate. Okay. So data security in water, it always finds the path of least resistance. So my statement to you is data will be compromised, no matter what you do, for the foreseeable future. Right? So what's realistic regulation? And I'll end it here. One, you're going to have gradual compliance. All right? This is going to be messy. It's going to take time, and you need to have process. All right? I'm not saying it's all about behavior. Government-led defenses has to start happening. Don't punish us. Why don't you try helping us a little bit more? All right? Government incentives to compliance. How about that one? How about rather than hitting me with a 2 and 4% tax, maybe you ought to give me a tax break if I comply? I mean, you know, give me some incentives to help me, because the cost of these things is so overwhelming in a world where the competition is so overwhelming with what's going on with technologies that it's very hard for organizations to stay afloat. And you need to reduce the cost of compliance, or you will have Sarbanes-Oxley. You'll have a very nice law. Everybody will be happy for a while. There'll be interpretation problems. Water will be all over the place. And 5 years from now, everybody's going to scratch their head and say, okay, what did we really accomplish in terms of what's going on? Because there'll be new things. So that's all I have to say about that. Any questions? You can throw things at me if you like. By the way, I'm excited about it. I mean, I think there's wonderful things. I think this is a great start, but I think you got to start working on these issues.
Well, thank you very much, Art. It was very interesting, and thank you very much to come from Colombia every year to tell us your point of view. I don't know if there is any question, but I like to say that we are talking about what we will do the next year about this conference here. Next year it will be in Aix-en-Provence. And we are thinking about talking about the law and the security breaches on the data services, and I think that would be the biggest subject for the next year.